of
They
English
should,
in graduate school.
did you get the stuff? Dan Cornston said he sent you some
I
stuff.
did. What he sent me was the his final speech
Oh,
and some court proceedings.
okay.
Um, but I'm still I
Well,
I
right, you're starting.
yeah. Um, I wonder how. Do you have some sort of thoughts about how to start? Where you would like to start talking?
Since, I don't know, like, there's so many places I could start. I could start with meeting McDonald. I could start with filing the lawsuit. I could start with going to California for the trial. I mean, I don't know where you're going to find your focus. If I were you right now, I wouldn't know you know, where I was going with this. Uh,
Exactly.
and it's, trying to think about it from your point of view, which is really my point of view because I can't help but thinking like a writer because that's what I am.
Yeah.
It may be sensible since you haven't read all the documents yet to, I could start talking about the trial, but would that have less meaning? It's the freshest, but it's also absent any context because you haven't had a chance
Yeah.
yet to really, come to terms with the specifics, the general ideas of what it's about. So I don't know.
One of the thoughts I had was that you at this moment, these feelings that you had about it all are still fresh, and maybe that's part of the story. You know, what happens to a writer when he's sued, and those feelings, those just that condition, that situation. It's kind of novel.
Yeah, less novel than it used to be.
Yeah, but it's novel for each individual
Right.
it happens to,
That's right.
right?
This is the first time it ever happened to me.
Yeah.
And I I expected it because McDonald had been saying ever since the book was published that he was going to get me for this. He would make me pay. He would. He felt betrayed. He felt. But then, on the other hand, I had my these assurances from my publisher and my publisher's legal people that I couldn't be sued by McDonald. They had read these releases that he had signed, and they said because of these releases, there's an absolute protection, and these are papers which are available, and they're part of the record of the. This Cornstein has them. It's not public record. They're certainly uh, easy to find. They went over the manuscripts as I'm sure happens in your case with the magazine. With when Knopf publishes a book, don't you have a meeting with a Random House lawyer and go through it?
I don't think it was a me I guess they go through it, and then if they
They
have
have
some things,
questions.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
then
when. My example with the Knopf book of mine at the end of the editorial process, I was turned over to the Random House lawyer who had read the manuscript with, and there, of course, none of it had been published in a magazine, so there hadn't been any previous legal review. And they just went through it and said, gee, uh, here's a problem. In the first chapter, you've got the scene on the ferry boat going up to Alaska, and you have these women misbehaving. This is, how big a town is this Wrangell, Alaska? Could they be identified, even though you don't identify them? By how many housewives from Wrangell had spent that weekend in Seattle or on their way back? It's entirely possible these people could be identified. This is a risk. They would identify areas of risk. And I said, well, look, you can't take that scene out. It's important for the start of the book. I've disguised their identities. There's no names. And, look, let's take our chances. So they didn't insist, but they raised that. That's the type of thing. Uh, in that case, it was invasion of privacy, not libel, that they were worried about. And it was funny because in that case, they said, well, we're going to have to check the Alaska statutes to see what the invasion of privacy history has been up there. Because in every state, invasion of privacy, unlike libel, it seems to vary from state to state. In New York, all you have to do is change somebody's name,
mhm.
and you avoid an invasion of privacy problem, even if they're otherwise identifiable. Other states, like California, are at the other end of the spectrum, apparently, where that legal history is not nearly so beneficial for writers.
Mhm.
So Alaska, the funny part about it was that in Alaska, it turned out there was no one in Alaska had ever sued anyone for invasion of privacy. It was a concept that hadn't ever, it didn't exist up there. Alaskans had been so seldom written about that there just simply was no actions ever had been taken. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that I'm used to going through with the book. In this book, there were a number of concerns raised by lawyers, but nowhere among them was any concern that Putnam's or I might be sued by Jeffrey and MacDonald because they relied upon these two separate releases. And Putnam's got a written opinion from their house counsel and then their outside counsel that we've reviewed the manuscript and we've reviewed the releases, and there's just that one thing you don't have to worry about is MacDonald. But I had come to know MacDonald fairly well, to the extent that the more I knew, the more I realized you can never come to know someone like that. I mean, the genuinely psychopathic personality is one that does not reveal itself in all of its complexity to anyone. But I had come to be able to predict, I think, behavioral responses, the way he was going to react to something. And I knew he was going to be enraged by this book. There's just no question he was going to be enraged because it was his opinion that even though he had granted me all these legal freedoms, and even though I had never told him that the book was going to be sympathetic or portray him in the manner he wanted to be portrayed in, even though I had never told him the book was going to make him look innocent, as you'll see, I expressed a lot of sympathy and I think genuine compassion for him in the first months after his conviction, when I was still confused, much more so in my mind and heart, really, about what had gone on than I am today. But never at any time did I ever said to him, look, the book, I promise you I'll write the book this way. You don't do that, because I didn't know how I was going to write the book. And in fact, I had extracted from him at the very beginning this release that gave me the freedom to write it with anything I chose. So I wasn't worried on that score because the Putnam's lawyers had told me nothing to worry about. But I was worried because I said, this guy just can't let this sit here. He's going to do something. He's going to have to do something. And what he did was to file the suit under these grounds that were not specifically mentioned in the release, although you would think that when the release says or anything else, it would cover anything else. So I was, I guess, both surprised and not surprised.
Yeah.
What was I remember hearing, I got a phone call from the Putnam's publicity person who said that she just gotten a call from some wire service that this lawsuit had been filed in California, and she wanted to know what I thought. Well, I don't know anything. This is the first I've heard of it. And she said, "Oh boy, this is going to be trouble." I said, "What do you know? How can you take this seriously? This is some kind of a joke." I mean, it just didn't strike me as being a serious problem.
Mm-hmm.
I've got these releases. The book tells the truth. What's to worry about? Then the papers came in the mail. And first, the only thing anybody focuses on in the beginning of a lawsuit, newspapers, right, is the amount of money that the guy is suing you for. Yeah, but Donald filed $15 million lawsuit. Well, as you know, that doesn't have any significance whatsoever. It could be 1 million, it could be 100 million. There's no. It's not like baseball arbitration where the player sets a figure and the club sets a figure. The figures are meaningless, but they're always in the headlines. Of more interest to me was to see what was it he was suing me for. And the papers did come in the mail a couple of days later. I remember it was in August, I was sitting right out in the backyard on that tree stump, flipping through them. And
this was the original complaint.
Yeah.
And did that remain the complaint, or was it amended?
It was never formally amended.
Yeah.
although at the interrogatory stage they get more specific. And it's some kind of supposedly streamlined procedure where you don't have to specify and enumerate everything that you're complaining about. You just give the general
Yeah.
grounds subject to amplification.
Yeah.
And the general grounds, it seemed to me, well, I mean, the complaint speaks for itself, as the lawyers say. The document speaks for itself. You can read it and you see what it says. But there were two main areas. One was the area of the money that he didn't think that he had gotten his full share that he should have gotten in terms of royalty payments this time. And I had no concern about that because all this had been handled, through my agent. The money comes in, it's apportioned, then it went out, and the guy was taking 10%. Sterling Lord, my former agent, was taking 10% of MacDonald too, and he was responsible for that. And as far as I could see, that was simply a matter of arithmetic, and it still looks to me like that's simply a matter of arithmetic. I think, obviously, in retrospect, it's better not to have that kind of an arrangement with somebody. But at that time, it just was, it was necessary if I were going to get kind of access to him that I thought I needed in order to tell the story fully, whatever it turned out to be. So that's sort of another area. But
Well, with the hero, do you feel now that in retrospect, if you hadn't made this arrangement with him, that he would have done it anyway, that this was sort of unnecessary for you to have shared the proceeds with him?
I don't know. He was focused on money and his need for money, and his lawyer was so focused on it. He would never have signed the release, I don't think, without receiving something in return. That was his consideration for signing this release that gave me the complete freedom, ostensibly, to write whatever it was. And this was a delicate situation because here you had somebody who had been accused of terrible, monstrous crime. For 9.5 years, he was saying he didn't do it. The only semi-legal proceeding ever held to investigate the question of his guilt or innocence had resulted in a finding that charges against him were not true, which is what the Army found in 1970. Then he'd been indicted, but, a lot of people are indicted and not convicted. I'm going to get the phone. Here I meet him, and he's about to go to trial. And I don't know what the hell to think. He's a personable guy, and he says this is the story, and it, as I say in the book, I think from the beginning I suspected there was more to it than he was telling me the first time we spoke, because it just doesn't add up that this guy, if our system discriminates against people, and I think it probably does, or the criminal justice system, it doesn't discriminate against physicians with Princeton education. This is not the kind of victim that the system sets out to squash. Steamrollers don't get started, down a hill with guys like that standing at the bottom. And his father-in-law, behind all this, who's his father-in-law? His father-in-law is a guy who sells eggs, in wholesale quantities, to Highland's mayonnaise and Prince spaghetti and stuff. This is the father-in-law. This is just a guy, just an ordinary guy with no influence at all. It's not like it was, Charles Percy, whose daughter was murdered, who's behind this thing. It's nobody with political influence. So I wondered why this was still coming, after 9.5 years. There had to be some basis for the Justice Department to have carried the thing this far. So I was a little bit uneasy about MacDonald's sort of glib explanation of how the whole thing, and as he told me the story, it sounded kind of canned. Obviously, he told it before. It was like a sales pitch. But to go from there to say, well, he must be guilty. I didn't know any facts whatsoever. So with a completely open mind, um, without even an inclination toward believing him or disbelieving him, I said, this is got to be a fascinating thing to write about, because either he did it or he didn't do it. There's no third alternative. Those people are dead. Somebody did that. And if this guy didn't do it, it's terrible what he's gone through. And if he did do it, well, then he's terrible. Now that's the unsophisticated first reaction. There are various permutations along the line. Where eventually a guy like Wambach says, "Well, no, it's not that simple. You're talking about good and evil, and here you have psychopath who's beyond those things." And then we can get into philosophical discussions of good and evil. And at that point, I wasn't looking in those areas. At that point, I'm saying, well, it's not like making a deal with the guy who's been convicted of murder. It's not like going up to some notorious convicted criminal and buying the rights to his story. He wanted to have money, and he wanted to have a book written. I wanted to have complete access to him during the trial and complete access to the documents, which it seemed to me I would otherwise not be able to have access to. He had, for example, all this grand jury testimony, which is always a secret. He had this Article 32 military hearing. He just had boxes and boxes of documents that piled up over 9.5 years. Most of all, I wanted the freedom. Now, you say you can have freedom just by sitting down like we're doing, and you have total freedom. But under libel law, without some kind of release sign, then there, as you discovered with Mason, there's this possibility that somebody unhappy can sue you for law. This is a far more delicate situation with MacDonald, because the guy is facing charges of murdering his family. Suppose the government, through inept presentation of its case, because you wind up with a couple of oddballs on the jury for any number of reasons, which I couldn't anticipate or foresee, but which it seemed to me could come into play. Suppose they fail to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to the jury's satisfaction that MacDonald had committed these crimes. Yet, suppose I, sitting there and looking at the whole thing, from his perspective as much as possible, still at the end of it come away feeling, oh my God, the guy did it. I think, I know what really happened, even though they didn't convict him. Here you have a man who's been found not guilty of these charges. And here you have me wanting to write a book that says, if not point blank, that at least can explain to a reader why I've come to feel the way I feel.
Yeah.
So the reader I want the freedom to do that. Well, you can't call a guy guilty of murder if a jury finds him not guilty without some kind of special protection. And
so this was already an issue for you right at the beginning. This question of whether he was. I had thought that you started out thinking he was innocent.
No. See, what I've said, I started out not knowing at all. Just absolutely not knowing.
Maybe we should get that chronology, how he approached you.
Okay. What I've said is that I started out willing and started out as a juror would, making the presumption of innocence.
Yeah.
Okay. He hadn't been proven guilty, so therefore I was willing to presume his innocence in the sense that a juror was, which is a very different thing from believing in his innocence. Because I didn't know any facts. The first time, I don't know if you remember when this happened, in 1970, reading about it in the papers. Were you familiar with this case at all?
No.
You didn't see the headlines?
I mean, I'm sure I saw the headlines,
But
read
it
a little
wasn't-
bit about it, but it's not
Yeah.
the kind of thing that I'm usually interested
Right.
in.
Right. Well, me neither, I mean, I never had written about a crime before. But I remembered that it turned out later, Nancy and I figured out, it's a peculiar thing, that the night of the murder was the first night that Nancy and I ever spent together, February 16th, 1970. Very odd circumstance, coincidence, right? But I remember being in New York and seeing the headlines, LSD, hippies, Green Beret family, all this stuff. And I said, that's a weird thing, because it was only 6 months after the Manson thing, and now here, this is like a replication of the Manson crimes, but an Army officer's wife and family, and to a lot of people, this story didn't sound plausible. Hippies on Army, but I read the headlines. Never found out what had happened. I didn't pay that much attention to it. I think I remember reading or being vaguely aware that they had eventually charged him with the crimes a couple months later, and paid no more attention to it. Had no idea what had ever happened. In 1971, I think it was. Yes, this was probably right. Early 71, January. Nessie would know for sure, but she got a call from a high school classmate of hers named Liz Friedman, who had worked as a paralegal or legal assistant with Bernie Siegel, McDonald's lawyer, at the Army hearing. It was Article 32 hearing, which is the prelude to a court-martial. If the Article 32 officer finds that there's sufficient cause, then it's like an indictment, and then you're court-martialed.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, he found that there wasn't sufficient cause, and so McDonald was released from the Army instead. But the charge is still hanging, but not up to the Army to pursue. So Liz Friedman called and said that this wonderful fellow McDonald had gone through this terrible ordeal, and his lawyer Siegel remembered me from Philadelphia. I had, before I started to write books, had worked in Philadelphia for the Philadelphia Inquirer. First, I was at the Bulletin as a sports writer for a year, and then I wound up writing a column 3 days a week for the Inquirer, which was a reporting-based column, like anything I wanted, mostly focused on Philadelphia things, but not exclusively. It was a Breslin type column, to put it somewhere on the spectrum, based on reporting rather than pontificating. It was just going out places and seeing, coming back and writing little stories about stuff that was going on. And at I did it for almost 2 years. And not much else has been done in Philadelphia then, so it attracted a lot of, it was attention. It was easy to attract attention in Philadelphia newspapers in the late 60s, because they were still very sleepy. And this was a new kind of a thing. And Siegel was a lawyer in Philadelphia. I had written a piece about a client of his, a kid from Penn, who had been charged with murder in a fraternity house fire, where the kid had gotten drunk, and they had thrown him out of a party, and he had come back, and he had doused some paper mache Christmas trees or snowmen or something with kerosene, and then threw a match, and a couple of guys got killed in this fire. And the kid was charged, and I don't even remember how I came to write the column, because it was one of 3 per week, but I wrote something about this kid. And in the course of doing that, I had some brief conversation with Siegel, who was his lawyer. And for that reason, or more, I think, just because of the overall, his awareness of the column, and by then The Selling the President had been published, and so here I am, somebody who writes books that attract attention. At least that one did. So Liz Friedman calls Nancy, and the pitch is, wouldn't Joe like to write a piece about this wonderful guy McDonald and the terrible Army, that did all this awful stuff to him? Because my bias, I guess, or political viewpoint was fairly clear in the column, and it was certainly not sympathetic to the military, in 1970, late 60s. So Siegel could foresee that I would be somebody who might want to take on a project that had to do with military injustice. And unbeknownst to me at that time, of course, MacDonald himself had already been writing to Robert Sherrill and to John Sack and to Jack Nelson, and there's a whole list of people MacDonald was writing to, trying to interest in this stuff. Nancy just told Liz Friedman that I was finishing a novel and couldn't do much with it then, but if they had a bunch of, she said they had a lot of things that we'll send, and she said we'll send them, and they never sent anything, and I forgot completely about Jeffrey MacDonald, and 8 years went by, and I finish Going to Extremes, June 1st, 1979. I wrote the last 4 pages, which are not chronologically in the book, the last 4 pages, but the last 4 pages that I wrote, that I put in a particular place in the book, I wrote in the very early morning and inserted them in the manuscript and wrapped up the manuscript, and we packed our bags and we drove past the post office. I mailed off the manuscript on June 1st, and we flew with Matthew, who had been born in January, to California, where Jim Bellows, I don't know if you know Bellows, he had been the editor of the Herald Tribune. He had been then, he'd done a lot of things in newspapers. He took over the Washington Star for a while when they were trying hard to revive that. And Bellows started this program called the Writer in Residence program at the newspaper, where somebody who was not primarily a columnist or a newspaper person would, for 6 or 8 weeks, be sort of a writer in residence and do occasional pieces or regular pieces. With each different writer, it worked out a different way. And Bellows had wanted me to do this in Washington at the Star, and I thought that would be fun. And I finished the Alaska book, get out to Washington for a couple of months, and just do that kind of a thing while deciding what book to do next. And I had agreed to do it, but it took me so long to finish the Alaska book, Going to Extremes, that by the time I finished it, Bellows had moved from Washington to Los Angeles, where he was attempting to revive the Herald Examiner, and he had instituted the same writer in residence program. So I had made a commitment to do it, but now the commitment was to do it in Los Angeles. So I put the manuscript in the mail to New York. We flew to Los Angeles and got there, and it was 105 degrees, and we had this baby, and we had this rented car, and we had this rented house in the San Fernando Valley in a place called Woodland Hills, and it was just terrible. It was awful, and it was the gasoline crisis, in the summer of '79, and so I couldn't even drive into downtown Los Angeles because you couldn't get gas for your car. They had to send a guy out on a motor scooter to pick up my columns, so I'd write in this little rented house, and I had no idea, after 4 years of writing about one thing, which was Alaska, suddenly I got to come up with 2 or 3 things a week. For 6 or 8 weeks, I'm going to be a newspaper columnist again. And I had never really had to work in Los Angeles. And I don't know how familiar you are with Los Angeles, but it's not a city like Washington or New York or Boston, right, where you can just sort of get into the city and sort of, pick up what's going on. There isn't anything in Los Angeles. The life is all sort of subterranean and disconnected. And, there's all these little different communities. I had no idea, how to, I had no idea what to do. And I hadn't given it any thought ahead of time. So the first thing I do is I look in the paper, see what's going on. Well, one of the first things I saw was that the Long Beach Police Officers Association are going to hold this benefit. There's a little bit of a controversy about it because they were using Long Beach police officer stationery to send out invitations to this disco party and dinner dance for MacDonald, this murder suspect. And I remember reading that and saying, "Oh my God, that's that same guy. This is that guy. Nancy, listen to this. How could this be? All these years later, this thing still hasn't been resolved. Remember that guy from 1970? With Liz Friedman? Yeah." And I said, "Jesus, this is amazing." I said, "I got to call this guy because, what a spot to be in, huh? This is certainly worth 600 or 800 words if the guy wants to talk about it. And I thought, well, my first thought was the guy is probably not going to want to talk at all. He wouldn't even return the phone call. I mean, here's a guy who's being accused and all those years, and now he's out here and go back. The last thing in the world the guy's going to want to do is talk to some stranger from a newspaper, and he must be besieged with people wanting to talk. Man, I figured I'll call, so I called the hospital, but she said he worked at this hospital. I was a secretary. She said, "Oh, he's up giving a lecture in San Francisco, and I'll give him the message." So I figure, well, I'll probably never hear from the guy. I'll call him again. The next morning, 7:00, 7:30 maybe. My phone rings. It's, "Hi, Jeff MacDonald. Uh, he says, how do you like it out here?" Well, I said, "Well, it's okay." And he says, "Yeah, Phil Examiner, it's a great sports section." I said, "Yeah, you're a sports fan?" Because he's like interviewing me, very sort of odd thing. I said, "Well, I want to talk to you about this whole case that you're involved in." And he's had no hesitation. He said, "Well, okay, when can you come down?" Um, it's like, "You say you want to talk to me about this whole case." I said, "Well, okay, Uh, I went to ask him to write this piece. And as I described in the beginning of the book, that one brief first person section, it was like that. We had this breakfast, and I'm asking him these questions. They said that he'll talk about anything. He'll talk about the persecution of him. He gets very indignant. He got the way they're out to get him, and how hard it is, and how difficult, how he's bearing up under all the strain. But of course, he wouldn't. I said, "Well, tell me, what, he said, oh, I can't really get into what happened that night. It's just much too painful. Brings back terrible memories. But I'll give you some material, And then we're back at his house, and he has this packet of clippings over the years, and the Colonel Rock report, the 64-page report that concluded that the charges against him were not true, which by itself, without access to the whole transcript of the hearing, without knowing anything, didn't make much sense to me. As a solitary document, it was hard to understand. There's no context for it. And he asked me at that time whether I'd be interested in writing a book about the case. And one of the reasons I had gone to California was to spend a couple of months figuring out what book to do next. And here was somebody, after 10 days out there, he's proposing that I write a book about this. And I could see immediately that there were potential problems, because here's a man who is maintaining his innocence of arguably the worst crime a person can commit, murdering his own family. And either he did or he didn't. And suppose it turns out that he did. Obviously, the book that I would write isn't going to be a book that is going to be pleasing to him if he says he didn't.
Yeah.
But that's not my concern, because I've written many things that are not pleasing to the people that I've written them about. My concern is, do I want to devote, a couple of years of my life to writing about this? And I didn't know. I said, I'll take the stuff. It's interesting. I didn't know how to figure out this guy. There was something, as I think I described in that first portion of the book, there's this extraordinarily charming surface. Reading about Mason, I was, struck by some similarities. The guy, he's sort of hyperactive, and he's very self-assured, and you have a sense that he's so manipulative that he kind of discounts his own manipulativeness by letting you almost see that he's being manipulative, and then, laughing with you about it, type of thing.
Yeah.
It's hard. And there were certain things. I mean, he didn't look like a grieving man. Okay, I mean, this guy is up against something very serious, but he's treating it like, geez, I got this parking ticket here, I got to get out and take care of. And he's got all the gold watches and the stuff, and he's very concerned about his appearance and his It's Southern California though, and I'm not judging this guy. See a lot of people in Southern California that are like that. And anyway, I drove back up that afternoon. The other peculiar thing was that driving down to see him, I had been following his directions off the freeway and Seal Beach Boulevard and things until you get to this condominium in Huntington Beach. And I had a radio station on. I wasn't paying attention to it. And it was a song I had been playing that I hadn't really been paying. If I had been listening harder, I probably would have hit to change the station because I didn't really like the song. But it was a song. At the end of it, just as I pull up in front of his place, the female disc jockey comes on this station and says, "I don't know what made me play that." She said it wasn't scheduled, but something just made me I just felt I had to play it. That was, as you know, she says, it was Talking Heads with a new thing called Psycho Killer Cassette. And that's the last thing I heard before meeting McDonald for the first time. I said, well, that's odd, I'd never heard that song before, to my knowledge, but this title stuck in my head. Because 60 seconds later, I'm shaking hands with this guy. And I just heard Psycho Killer Cassette. She doesn't know why she played it, I still don't know what to make of that. McDonald has given interviews in which he said it's obvious to him now that I had made up my mind that he was guilty before I met him for the first time, or else I would never even have remembered that. Well,
did you mention that to him then?
Not then, no.
But later.
Later, I think I did. If to him, I don't think I ever mentioned it to him, but I think it stuck in my mind so much that when the book was published and I'm on this publicity tour thing, I'm sure there were instances where that came up. Or else I even wrote about it in I wrote about it in the book. Toward the end of the book. It's when I go back to California. The book, there's a very small first person section in the beginning, and there's a whole main body of the book, and then at the end I'm trying to come to terms again in the first person with what this whole thing is. And at that point it's in the book. Mm-hmm. And then I think I put out when asked about it, I talked about it. Yeah. But it has always stuck in my mind as odd. It's not that subtle, right?
Yeah.
A psycho killer test is up. But I went back to this rented house and we had people over for dinner and I'm sitting there, I'm reading the stuff over the weekend and I'm thinking, I've never done anything like this before. Never written about a crime, a trial. I've never really been inside a courtroom. This could be interesting. But right away, I'm worried because I said, suppose the guy did it, but, or I suppose I think he did it, but he's not convicted. And then I write a book, that says he did it. I'm in trouble. I had even told McDonald that first meeting. I said, well, I don't know, whether I would be interested in writing a book about this or not. But I'd have to tell you that if I did, there's two things I can tell you right up front that I would have to have. And one would be total access during the trial. I wouldn't want to just go to the trial and sit there and watch it in the courtroom, and say, hi once in a while. I would want to do it from sort of inside looking out, I'd want to have total access to you and your lawyers and everything, because it seemed to me that, like the selling of the president, for the first time had gotten inside that aspect of a presidential campaign, looking at the advertising people as they went about the task of creating this image for Nixon and how do you handle the defense? I'd never seen a book written from inside the defense at a major trial of any kind by anyone who wasn't associated with the defense.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever done that.
No.
Yeah.
It hadn't been done to my knowledge. I mean, if DeLorean writes a book about the DeLorean case or somebody who worked for DeLorean, that's a different thing. Because, they're paid to have a point of view and they have a point of view. But somebody objective, I mean, most...
There have also been accounts of trials, but never right. from that intimate a situation.
Right. So that's what appealed to me right up front was let me do it this way, which had never been done before.
Yeah.
And that way, however it comes out, it's got to be fascinating. I mean, you're going to have a 6 or 8 week dramatic event here that's going to have, some dramatic conclusion. The narrative is sort of all built in, and you just write it from that perspective, but obviously with the independence to form my own opinions and to write it the way that seemed artistically most satisfying.
I mean, as it turned out, you didn't begin with the trial, but
That's
you
right.
haven't even reached the trial.
No, the trial, as it turned out, which there were many different approaches that I tried in writing this book before. The version that you see, is not the way. I didn't just sit down and say, "Oh, okay, so I'm gonna write the book." And
Yeah.
this was a hard
Yeah.
thing to come to terms with on many levels. Not the least of which was how to organize it. I mean, it
Yeah.
just was a terrible thing to have to organize. It kept changing. There's, what came out of the trial had so little to do with what I became ultimately interested in, which was the inside of McDonald's head. Once you figure out that he did it, which takes a while, then you have to ask yourself, but how could he? I mean, this is the essence of his whole complaint now, is that if I figured it out, I should have told him I figured it out. I had an obligation to tell him, instead of letting him still think that I was sympathetic to him. But, the two things can coexist, which is a concept that I'm sure we'll talk about if we keep talking. At that point, I wanted the access and I wanted the freedom. And he had said to me he would need some money, for his legal fees and things. What I did is I called my agent and I said, I'm thinking about this, and I want to get down to this dinner thing, this big fundraising thing that they had. Well, I wrote the column, okay, which I had set out to write based on my brunch with the guy, and I go to the dinner, which is like 10 days or maybe just a week later, and just a day or two after the column had appeared, and these various people are saying, "Oh boy, did Jeff talk to you about this column?" "Oh, he was really upset." And I said, "Oh, really? Why was he upset?" "Oh, because he talked about his blonde-haired stewardess girlfriend and about his boat and about his all the stuff he didn't want. He doesn't want it. He doesn't want that emphasized. He wants it to be about how he's a great doctor and he's suffering and how unfair it all is." And I said, "Well, I quoted him and said, yeah, but you put that stuff at the top and he didn't like that." I said, "Well, if he wants to talk to me about liking it, and I wrote it. There it is, And he never did. I mean, it's interesting because now he's said in depositions and things that he called me up and said, "Joe, what kind of crap is this?" And that I said, "Oh, the editors made me do it that way." And they it's this invented, conversation. He never expressed any displeasure at that column. Never even referred to it. Siegel appears at this dinner. I talked to Siegel. I hadn't seen him. I didn't know Siegel, except from that brief thing in Philadelphia, and I had totally forgotten about him. In fact, when I met MacDonald, I think it says in the book the first thing he said to me was, "Bernie Siegel said to say hello," and I just drew a total blank. Who? I don't know. Your lawyer? Oh, Philadelphia. And finally, as he goes into more detail, I vaguely remember I once read this column about this kid.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure that I ever met Siegel. I mean, I just spoken to him on the telephone. Anyway, I did talk to him on this occasion, and he said, "Well, Jeff's the greatest man in the world, and I've had lots of clients, but this is the one. Oh my God! And the government, they're so vicious, and they're out to kill this guy. And oh, sure," he says, "you got to come with us, and you got to live there right with us, and see how." "Oh yes," he says, you can write the kind of book that's never been written before." I said, "But of course, I have to have protections and releases." And he says, "Well, don't worry about that, And I said one thing that bothered me. I said, suppose the jury finds him not guilty, and then his 10-year nightmare is at an end. And then the last thing in the world he's going to want to do is sit around and talk about it, for months afterward with a guy who's writing a book. What's to prevent him at that point from just saying, well, thanks for your interest, but now that it's over, goodbye,
The trial was just about to come up, is
Yeah.
that it? And you felt that you would need time afterwards.
Oh, sure. To go back before, I mean,
There wasn't time before the trial to talk to him.
yeah, almost no time. I mean, he left for New York and North Carolina the weekend of July 4th, and I don't think I met him for the first time until June 10th. And in between, I was still doing my thing out there, and we only had one or two. We had two other in-person meetings, one of which was at this big dinner. And so there's no time, as he's preparing for trial, there's no time to sit down and say, okay, now let's talk about your days at Princeton. Let's talk about how did you meet your wife? That's all to come later. And I said to Siegel, suppose, what's to stop him from deciding that, quite rationally, that he's just sick of it now. It's over.
Yeah.
And so, oh, no, if Jeff makes a commitment, he's the world's most honorable man. If he knew Jeff like I knew Jeff, if he tells you, you can count on it. And I said, well, I may need more than that. My publisher might need more than that, whoever my publisher turns out to be. I hadn't even gotten into that yet. And Siegel was mostly concerned about the money. He says, well, I haven't been paid and my fees are big and, there's a lot. I said, I don't deal with money. My agent deals with money. Here's the thing, you and my agent talk. And then I said to Sterling Lord, I said, this looks to me like it's going to take me 2 years of full-time work if I do this. I got to figure out how much money I would need as an advance spread out over 2 years so I could continue to live and work on this book. If you can get in advance, this is what I need. If you can get more than that from a publisher and you work out an arrangement with Siegel where it's apportioned in some way that MacDonald gets something beyond what I need, I don't have any qualms or objections to that, and eventually that's what happened. The original publisher wound up being Delacorte. This was a time, Knopf had just bought Going to Extremes, and Gottlieb had said that, I don't think Gottlieb, I don't think Bob likes nonfiction crime books. I just don't think it's, if you look at Knopf's list over the years, there haven't been any. When he bought Going to Extremes, he was aware that this is what I was doing, because they actually bought Going to Extremes while I was in North Carolina at the trial. And we talked about, with Ash Green, who was the editor of Knopf, who I knew better than Bob. We talked about this book, and I think they made an offer that wasn't anywhere near what a couple of other offers were. Knopf never been famous for large advances, and this wasn't a book that it was either Ash or Bob who said, well, we found that it seems like these nonfiction crime books never do very well anyway, and we're just not that interested in pursuing this in a big way. And I remember getting back to New York in the fall when I was going through the final galleys and stuff with the turning the final revised version that's going to Extremes manuscript and talking to Gottlieb, and he said, well, just finish up this crime thing as fast as you can, then you can back your, and then we'll resume your career at Knopf. And this was like the one book that wasn't going to be a Knopf book, and then the others were all going to be Knopf books again. But here, nobody wanted to publish this book. I said, this is a phenomenal story. I thought, you can't lose in a way as a publisher or a writer, because you have one of two outcomes. Either the guy is a terrible victim of a system run amok, or he's some sort of terrible monster who has somehow still managed to attract this band of fervent supporters. How can it's got to be interesting. That's I was just so curious. That's what gets me into anything. I just wondered, well, who is this guy? What's he really all about? And what really happened? And it'd be something. There wasn't a lot of initial interest. Part of that, I think at that time, it had been 10 years since I'd had a book that made money for my publisher. Selling the President did. My novel, which Random House published, certainly didn't make them any money. And then my next nonfiction book, which Viking published, didn't make them any money. And I had just finished the Alaska book, but that hadn't been published yet. So Sterling Lord is talking to the publisher about a guy who wasn't exactly surefire best-selling author, and you're talking about a pretty significant advance. What ultimately came from Delacorte, I think, was they were hardcover and paperback together because it was Delacorte Dell, and I think the original advance was something like $200,000. It's just a lot of money. I forget the figure I gave Sterling. I said something like how much. It wasn't. I didn't say that I didn't need $200,000. But as usual, I guess wrong by about a factor of 2. And how long the book was going to take me? It took twice as long. And at that time, they worked out the money thing. And I'm in North Carolina, and we signed these documents. Simple little.
So MacDonald got a small percentage.
MacDonald got 20% of the first $150,000 was the way it reads. And 33% of any publishing earnings thereafter. And if there were to be any dramatic rights sale, movie or TV, he would get 40% of that. So in other words, I got what I would need to do the work. And then if it turned out to be highly successful, he would benefit in a ratio that continued to step up. But in the beginning, I said, it's my time and it's my life and it's my, and I can't, I don't have a lot of those with people. He just writes them, says it's a very checkbook, but he pays them money for these releases right up front, a flat sum. When you get talking to Siegel about this thing, the day that I met MacDonald the first time, what I didn't know was that later that afternoon, he went and had a meeting with Wambaugh, who was trying to interest Wambaugh in this project, as he had been since 1975. And as they continued to try to do, even after I had arrived in North Carolina, they were still talking to Wambaugh on the phone, and ended up not doing it. But what he would have done would have been to say, I'll pay you X amount of money. You sign this. We go to work. I write my story, and it's about you, and you have no rights over what I say. And that means you can't. You're waiving your rights if you otherwise have. You have no right to privacy. You have no right to sue for libel. You have no right to sue for anything. If you don't like it, it's just too bad. That's what you're getting paid for. That's the way Wombaugh's always worked. Well, I had never worked this way at all. As I told you, I'd never met anybody who ever raised the question of money, and it always made me uncomfortable. I said, this is something. There's something I don't like about it, but I don't feel that it's quite to the level of a moral or ethical dilemma. It's just something that I don't quite like. But weighing that on a scale of how much do I like the story, I was able to rationalize it pretty easily at that time, the money thing. And as long as he would sign whatever the publishing lawyers put together in terms of a release, so that I knew I could have complete freedom. And they sent out a release on about the beginning of August, as the trial was maybe 3 weeks into the trial. He'd already signed the, there were 2 or 3 documents. The thing about the money would be a thing that said that I would have the exclusive rights, because it occurred to me or to my agent or to somebody that gotta make sure that the guy doesn't go off and make, he doesn't go back to California and decide that if he can interest Joe Wambaugh after all, then he's going to give Wambaugh all of his materials. I know, so were you. So, beside all these things, and he signed the release. And the release comes in, and the release is a release which the Delaware court lawyer had written up, which, again, it speaks for itself. But there's one paragraph in there that says, in regard to suing my publisher or me for defamation, Siegel, the lawyer, looks at it and says, well, let me just say here, as long as the essential integrity of my life is maintained. It was in the form of a letter from Jeff to Joe. Dear Joe, I understand you're writing a book about my life and crime and stuff. And, in order that you may be free to write the book in the manner you deem best, and it goes on and on. So he made that one handwritten change to that one paragraph, which seems to be the fulcrum on which a lot of this stuff is swinging back and forth. Not all of it, because I think without any releases, without any contractual thing, without any money thing, he still has his basic grievance about emotional distress and fraud, in that I led him to believe, or allowed him to believe, or did not discourage the belief that I was sympathetically inclined toward him, even after I had stopped being sympathetically inclined toward him. That, it seems to me, is sort of in box number 2. It's not connected to contractual release language. I mean, anybody can say that about anybody. I'm sure Mason felt that you were going to view him more sympathetically than you ultimately did. People ask you questions, in their conversations. I mean, you must give answers. You give an answer that encourages the subject. I mean, and then in the end, the book comes out, the piece comes out. Say, God, this isn't. I thought she was on my side. What the hell is this? Then you go sue for fraud. Well, if you do, you can do it whether or not there's been any documents signed. So it seems like those are two separate sort of realms, and he's in both of them here. The first one could have been avoided if there had been none of this release stuff. It's ironic that a release which is designed to increase the degree of protection afforded to the author and publisher, in this case appears to be being used to diminish it.
Mm-hmm. Because of the money that passed.
No, because of the language in the release. Because
I see. Yeah.
See, you have a release that says, I promise that I will never sue you for anything, no matter what, the rest of my life, no matter what you ever do or say about me. And even if you've obtained this by defrauding me, there may be a way to word it. There may not be anymore that would offer absolute protection. You can defame me. You can make up the worst. You can just, the stuff can be false, and I don't care. I promise I'll never sue you. Period. And have 100 witnesses and have the guy have 3 lawyers co-sign it. Still, I think you're going to find some judges who say, well, now releases, we're not sure what the jury decides. Okay. But you start from a point of zero, extra freedom beyond that which is afforded by the First Amendment. And a release is designed to go from 0 up to infinity, depending on how strongly worded and how broad it is. How can it be less than 0? How can a release take away freedom? The very nature of release means, I'm releasing you from what otherwise would be an obligation that you might have under the law. That's, publishers and movie studios and television people, they rely very heavily upon these things. And they're all quite threatened by this aspect of this case, in that, can it be that a guy who signs 2 separate releases 18 months apart, a guy who turns out to be a convicted murderer, yes, can then come along and say the releases don't mean anything? And a judge can say, well, that's a question for the jury to decide. This is something that is quite worrisome to a lot of people, and should be, because so many people rely so heavily upon release. The judge here seems to be saying that because of that handwritten addition, referring to essential integrity, I somehow incurred an affirmative obligation that I would not have had if there had been no release. And that just seems so wacky to me. I don't know what else to say. I mean, that anybody could look at a release, and because one paragraph of it is modified by certain language, say that instead of adding something over here on the plus side, it puts me over here and takes away freedoms.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I'm not going to sign it. I didn't even sign this.
I mean, this would obviously, if it ever goes on and you would lose, this would be overturned by some other.
Well, one would like to think so. Yes. I mean,
Yes, it is, right?
yeah. And that part of it just seems so self-evident.
Yeah.
But not to our friend Judge Ray, who seems to, I mean, I just ultimately throw up my hands on this question because it's been argued so plainly and so clearly, and it seems to be a point that's doesn't even require argument. And the other judges, you know, the magistrate out in California who did the discovery hearing, in the transcript of that, which was made, his comments were, well, look, it doesn't matter what that paragraph says or how it's modified, because look at the next paragraph. This is the next paragraph, which isn't modified at all. McDonald says, in order that you might be free to do whatever you want to do, you know, I hereby say that I will not sue for libel, evasion of privacy, or anything else by virtue of anything contained in the book. And that's not modified by any language. So it almost doesn't matter what the
Yeah.
So, and that was the basis on which he threw out all this discovery stuff, saying, you know, this is a libel thing in disguise, and if you want to sue for libel, go sue for libel. But, you know, you got this. The judge,
Who wrote the release?
lawyers from Delacorte, which was the original publisher.
And this was a standard release.
Well, there's no such thing as a standard release. I think this was a release that they felt was satisfactory for their purposes.
Yeah.
And when I delivered the manuscript to Putnam's, there was that release plus a second release signed in December of '81, which was drawn up by lawyers for the producer who wanted to turn this into a movie. And ultimately it became a TV thing. But NBC relied upon those releases, and in particular the second release. The second release is as broad and comprehensive as any document could ever be. It says that he gives me the right to make any use that I want of any materials relating in any way to his life, to portray him in any way I want, that I can use anything he said, all or in part, anyway, that I can fictional. This actually gives me the right to invent, to make stuff up about him, even to make up defamatory stuff about him. I mean, it is so sweeping and so broad that it was almost embarrassing.
Yeah.
I mean, he signed it. He had it for 6 weeks. He said he didn't like it because it was so broad, but he signed it. And in return for it, he was, you know, I guess you have to have consideration. Well, you know, he gets $1, but he also this was necessary for the producer to go ahead and deal with NBC about the miniseries. So, you know, whatever share of those proceeds he got was how he benefited.
Did he sign this before the trial?
No, the first one he signed in the midst of the trial. August 3rd, I think, 1979. Then he was convicted in late August of '79. He spent 11 months in prison on the conviction, appealing it. After 11 months, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals found that his right to a speedy trial had been violated by the Justice Department back in the early '70s. They didn't prosecute him promptly enough once the Army had released him. And on a 2-to-1 decision, they overturned they overturned the indictment. They didn't even deal with the trial. They said that he should never have been tried in the first place because this violated his right to a speedy trial. Eventually, the government, the Justice Department, appealed that to the Supreme Court, which in a 6-3 decision, you reversed the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals panel, which had been you want. Before you go to the Supreme Court, you can go for what's called an en banc reviewing before the full circuit, and to grant that, there has to be a majority of judges in the circuit who want to, we cannot overturn the panel and have a rehearing for the full group. And then I think the vote was 5-5 on whether or not to rehear it. So the speedy trial question was always very close as a matter of law, until it got to the Supreme Court where, it was 6-3. So he was free for 18 months, after his conviction. This is all the while that I'm writing a book, and this is one of the in a whole period of time which was never very relaxed. This perhaps the strangest, because he's free. He's confined to the state of California because it's still in field, but he's out of jail and he's back, and
Imagine his patience, right? I mean, to go to a doctor.
well, see, people aren't voting him because he's an emergency room doc, so he works in the emergency room. So you're fielded on a stretcher, right?
Yeah.
And you're
Fantastic.
that's his thing. He doesn't have private patients. He just works a duty shift in an emergency room, and he takes whatever is brought in the ambulance. So they don't have a choice. He before his trial, he had done a lot of lecturing in the areas of child abuse. Very strange thing for a guy to get interested in, given his circumstances. It later came to seem to me more sinister than interesting. But there was a symptom, a manifestation of something very troubling. I mean, he would talk about show slides of battered children and things, and he'd lectures. And this is a guy who, what he did to his own kids is just awful. Just awful. I mean, this whole thing was so bad to have to get involved in. I mean, it's not the lawsuit that would ever make me wish I hadn't done it, but it was the experience of writing this book was unlike anything else. I mean, you write about a presidential campaign, you write about Alaska, you write about anything. You write about the murder of little girls and this pregnant woman. And to be exposed firsthand to the evidence, the crime scene photographs. It's just stuff I've never had to. I'm not a hardened homicide cop. I'm not Joe Wambaugh. This was very upsetting to me, and that was part of the big problem. I couldn't reconcile this guy who I had become so well acquainted with, at least superficially, with a person capable of having done this to his own wife and children. So there's this enormous tension between what the physical evidence presented at trial suggests so strongly, and my own emotional reaction, which was that he couldn't have done this. Yeah. He couldn't have done that. You'd have to be just crazy. I mean, God, he couldn't do that. Then he calls me. Then he's free. He calls me on the phone. Hey, how you doing? Come on out there. I'm writing about him. I'm trying to do this to maintain this dichotomy that you have to between your personal relationship with someone about whom and their subject thing. As you enter into somebody's life where you really have no right to be and start to live it with them, it gets much more intimate in a way than sitting here with a tape recorder. But even this over a period of many hours and weeks and months, I'm sure you find there's two people. So there has to be a personal component in anything like this. Here, you have a subject with MacDonald who's consciously trying to play on that to win my sympathy, to get me to believe him and portray him the way he wants to be portrayed. And I'm wrestling internally with these horribly difficult questions of, well, he must have, but yet how could he? Well, just and all the while, just just engulfed in the horror of what it is he did, or someone did. What happens to those people? And when he's out of prison for 18 months there, even though I only saw him, I think, on 2 occasions during those 18 months, um, I'm writing the book, and he is, of course, very curious about the book, but keeps repeating to me in letters, which have become documents now at trial. Of course, I understand you have the freedom to write the book any way you want. I've never tried to infringe upon that. I recognize that it's your book, and you have artistic control, and all these different things, which so what he said in the releases. All the while, he's convinced himself that what I'm going to do was going to be a wonderful thing for him, that he's going to be portrayed as an innocent victim. And all the while, I'm getting deeper and deeper into this forest of his thickets of his mind, and I come to recognize that what I'm dealing with is not the person who had appeared on the surface to be this kind of person, but something very, very different, something I'd never really been confronted with before. And you can start to get clinical and give it definitions, call him a sociopath, call him a pathological narcissist, call him, depending on whatever school you're most comfortable in, the nomenclature would vary, but you're talking about somebody here who isn't. Well, where's the thing for Ruby Quickly? I mean, I'll just get the best description. The Quickly book is still in the process. Well, it's still in Corstein's office, but okay. Kleppi in the Master Sanity says, in all the orthodox psychoses, there's a more or less obvious alteration of reasoning process, some other demonstrable personality feature. In the psychopath, this is not seen. The observer is confronted with a convincing mask of sanity. All the outward features of this mask are intact. It cannot be displaced or penetrated. Examination reveals not merely an ordinary two-dimensional mask, but what seems to be a solid and substantial structural image of the sane and rational personality. Well, this is MacDonald, exactly. The observer finds verbal and facial expressions, tones of voice, and all the other signs we have come to regard as implying conviction and emotion and the normal experiencing of life as we know it ourselves and as we assume it to be in others. Only very slowly, and by a complex estimation or judgment based on multitudinous small impressions, does the conviction come upon us that, despite these intact rational processes, these normal emotional affirmations, and their consistent application in all directions, we are dealing here not with a complete man at all, but with something that suggests a subtly constructed reflex machine which can mimic the human personality perfectly. Kind of frightening,
Yeah. Mm.
So perfect is this reproduction of a whole and normal man that no one who examines him in a clinical setting can point out in scientific or objective terms why or how he is not real. And yet we eventually come to know or feel we know that reality, in the sense of full, healthy experiencing of life, is not here. Now, what do you do 2 years into a project when you come to sense that that's who you're subject to? What, at the same time as you sense that, you have become convinced, by then you are convinced, reasonably convinced, almost convinced, convinced is word down was taking on legal meaning. I'm reluctant to use it, but you certainly by then are more comfortable with the opinion that, yes, indeed, he he did do this. It's become unavoidable.
Right, the one follows the other. If he did it, then he can't be a normal person like the other people one knows, right?
Right.
So that you began to, I guess, have to place him in some special category.
Right.
It's-
How could he have? See, the prosecutor at the trial in 79 said, if we can prove he did it, we don't have to prove he's the kind of guy who could have done it. And that's a way to defuse all this great character testimony that he had from the nuns and the cops, doctors, and his friends.
Yeah.
That he's a great guy. Well, for me,
You had a different.
I had a whole different task. And they had proved to the jury's satisfaction that he did it. But that's only the beginning for me. Now I've got to figure out, if he did it, how could he have? And who is he? You come to see over a period of time that he is this reflex machine mimicking the human personality almost perfectly. That, that's when I began to do more in this whole area of pathological narcissism and the narcissistic personality disorder. I come to see that he's, in some respects, perhaps is unique, but he's representative of a particular classification of mental illness. It sure isn't obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so, the narcissistic thing, so strong a strain there is this surface charm, this need to manipulate, and a skill doing it. And I've been around a lot of people who've, because I'm writing about them, tried to manipulate, get used to it. It happens all the time. But this guy was this guy world class. I mean, this is really somebody. Yes, I felt terrible when he was convicted. I mean, I'm writing him letters for months afterwards, in which I am expressing genuine sorrow and compassion. And now in the trial here, he's making, in my case, he's suggesting that I had made up my mind ahead of time, and that these letters were all written solely for the purpose of luring him into a greater sense of trust. And if you when you read these letters, you see, I couldn't fake something. I couldn't. I'm not that good that I could fake that kind of feeling enough later. Now, later when I get to this point, and this point is probably into the book by now, I've spent time with in-laws and some of the prosecution people, and I've had access to all kinds of further evidence and material. And plus, he's been sending me all these tapes, which the more I listen to, the more troubling.
These were those passages about his sexual relations with his wife and girlfriend, and he just taped that himself.
Yeah. These sections in the book,
him speaking,
the voice of, he sent me cassettes, sometimes in response to specific questions, where I would say, look, I want you to talk more about this or about that. I still need to get a better feeling for what kind of a person Colette was. She seems like a cardboard figure. The way you talk about her is all cliches. But a lot of it was just without any direction from me. When he was locked up, I went out when he finally arrived in California to talk to him about, well, now how am I going to proceed with the book? You're in prison here. Okay. I live back there in the East. I can't, stay out here and move out here and visit you every night. And even when I was visiting him in the prison, I was not permitted to take notes. The guards, just the policy. I couldn't bring in a tape recorder, and I couldn't take notes. So what am I going to do? Here's my central figure, and he's locked up, and I said, look, there's only two ways we can do this. One is you can just, start writing, and your, sort of your autobiography, just start telling me, I never even started to get into at the trial, I was focusing always on the trial. I never asked him any questions about his earlier life, and I had no idea really still who he was, where he had come from. It all come through observing him in this unique circumstance of being essentially on trial for his life, because while there was no death penalty, there was, permanent incarceration. And then he was convicted. So now is the time to have to go back deeper, further. How? Well, one way is writing. The other way, which either he suggested or I suggested, and this is now in dispute in this litigation, was taped. He said he would find it easier to talk into a recorder and just mail me the cassettes. And that's what he did. And they began coming and coming and coming and coming. And then it would stop for a while. And then I would write to him and say, send me some more tape. As I listened to them, as was the case with Dr. Stone here, the Kernberg associate, when you listen to them and see what I had a Williams student here transcribing them for me, so I had the whole thing on paper too. Something is wrong. Something just isn't there. It's not what is there so much as what isn't there. There's this lack of affect, of feeling in describing things where there should be some, and then there is. It's all inappropriate. I mean, I can see that if you're sitting in a cell in a federal prison talking into a machine that you're not really supposed to have in there, you're not going to have your normal range of emotion in your voice. It was the obsession. It wasn't that so much as the obsession with the irrelevant. I mean, he would go on for 15 or 20 minutes describing 2 or 3 football games that he played in 7th grade and who he tackled and what the kid's name was, and he would spell it out for me, and this incredible recall of irrelevant detail that I wouldn't want to be impolite to him, but I would say, gee, doesn't it occur to him that I couldn't possibly be interested in this? I mean, we're talking about this over here,
Because but as you talk, you're acting as you're telling me about this, as if he's not making these tapes for you. He was talking to you in those tapes, right?
Yes. These tapes were made
So that was
specifically
some
for
kind
me.
of a communication to you, this being so boring, no?
Well,
I mean, if you accept the idea that everything is a communication, that
yes, right, on one level, okay. I mean, what was he conscious of as he was doing this?
That was all probably unconscious, right?
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of it. The growing impression that I got was consistent with what Fletcher's talking about in there. That's slowly and by a multitudinous series of small impressions, a large part of which were the tapes, the impressions that the tapes made. I mean, it got so that when a tape would come in, I would play it, and Nancy would say, "Oh no, not more! Oh God, won't he ever stop? He's only up to the 8th grade." I mean, it's just, and he wouldn't talk about the things that obviously mattered, and he wouldn't.
To you, I mean, it sounds very aggressive.
Mattered. Who sounds aggressive?
He does, as if he's deliberately frustrating you and boring you and not giving you what you want.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Right. And I'm not there to say to him, let's forget about 7th grade football games. Let's talk about. So I would write to him. I said, look, let's. I need more about your decision to go into the Army, or tell me about Chicago medical school. I was just trying to get him away from his childhood, where the memories were so sanitized as to be obviously, even to someone who's not trained in psychotherapy, you just see this. There's something wrong here. This is not the way somebody is honestly recalling scenes from their childhood. He's not really free associating, and so everything was always just wonderful, and he was always the stuff. Some of the professionals who have dealt with him have talked It's in the grand jury section where they're testifying about his nostalgic yearning for these earlier days, where everything was, all right, so here's a guy in jail, murdering his wife and kids. You could see that he might be nostalgic for his seventh grade, football season or something, where he was still a star and none of the bad stuff had ever happened to him. But who's he talking to? As you said, he's talking to me. For what purpose? For the purpose of my putting this stuff into a book in some form. I didn't ever say to him, I am going to quote passages verbatim as you recite things into the tape. I'm gonna use that which I think helps to portray you most effectively. I didn't know I was going to do that. I had no idea what use I was going to make of this material. The idea of using these voice sections in the beginning of the book as a way of trying to recreate for the reader the experience that I went through, where you just gradually come to see that something isn't quite right. The phrasing, the descriptions, something is off. I wanted that to be a gradual impression formed by the reader, as it was formed by me. But I was well into the book before I first thought of using excerpts from the tapes in that way, interspersing them with the events from the beginning. Because the problem is, sort of mechanically or technically with the story, you have to bring it forward so that there's a narrative that the reader can be interested in. At the same time, you have to go deeper because that's where the real story seems to lie. Why would a reader care about Jeffrey MacDonald if they didn't know what had happened? On the other hand, what meaning does any of what happened have beyond the level of daily journalism, newspaper reporting, unless you come to learn and care more about what kind of person MacDonald is? And so I wrestled for a long time with how do you work all this in? What do you do when your central character turns out to be a pathological liar? When everything he tells you, independent checking reveals to be not everything, many, many things, many of these specific detailed recollections, youth, were just fantasies.
Yeah.
I said, what can you believe? And how can you determine what you can believe? How can I tell the reader this is the way MacDonald's relationship was with Colette in high school? I can't recreate that in a work of nonfiction and say this is the way it was, because at this point I have no one to rely upon for that description except him. And his descriptions, I have come to learn through other areas, are unreliable. So my solution ultimately was I'll let him tell the story in his words. I'll let the reader hear it in his words, and then the reader can perhaps come to the same point of no longer accepting what he says at face value that I ultimately came to.
Yeah.
But to take, I used them in that way. I'm not sure what led to all this. So,
It's parentheses, isn't it? And it's
Yeah.
the main narrative.
yeah. Where's the main narrative? He was, what was on? He was convicted. He was out for the 18 months, and then he was reincarcerated.
But you were starting to tell me about this kind of really nightmarish experience you had of suddenly dealing with this guy, or gradually realizing that this man was not a normal person, and coupled with your growing conviction that he was guilty. I guess the two are interrelated, and then having to speak with him over a period of time. That seems to me really to be so. Did you talk to other people about this, for instance, or did you talk to a therapist about it, and what was happening with you? I mean, that's
Well, I talked a lot to Nancy. I talked when I was still very confused. Right, confused. By the end of the trial, I mean, it's like such a central point in this whole litigation now. What did McGinniss know? When did he know it? And I, yeah, I think that by the end of the trial, I had certainly come to recognize that there was good reason for him to have been accused of these crimes, and that a jury verdict of guilty would have a certain foundation upon which it could rest. I mean, was I convinced beyond a reasonable doubt at the same time the jury was? That's a question that I've now been asked so many times under oath, and otherwise, that um, it's it's hard to answer in any way that goes beyond answers that I've already given. But of course, I ask myself that what what did I feel? That I felt then that I didn't have to make a decision. I said, "Gee, I'm glad I'm not a juror."
Hmm.
I didn't even say that, you know, consciously to myself, because when you're in the middle of something that intense and you're in the recording phase, what you're doing is sort of absorbing. You're not reflecting.
No,
At least I wasn't. All my pores are open. All my nerve endings are alive. I'm
you're
just
taking
taking
in,
everything in.
you know,
It's a complete, huge inhaling of every sensory impression on all levels, all at once. And you have an extraordinarily dramatic event, series of events about to reach the climax. I mean, moment of most incredible tension is when I'm sitting in a room about the size of this room, maybe, with McDonald and his lawyer and his secretary, and she's on the phone making reservations for him to go to dinner in New York the next night, and he's going to take a. I'm going. One of his lawyers and I are going on a hiking trip in the Tetons, and he wants to come to this wilderness photography workshop that a friend of mine is running, and he's making all this stuff. But the jury is down the hall deciding whether or not he murdered his wife and daughters 9.5 years earlier, and whether, and then they actually come, and they knock on the door, they say they have a verdict. I mean, talk about adrenaline. I mean, God, I mean, it wasn't me, but that whose fate was being determined here. But just what a heart pounding sort of rush of. I mean, this isn't the movies. This is real life. These were real people who were killed, and now there's other real people who have been sitting there, and it's only been 6.5 hours, and now they've come back, with a verdict. And what's he going to be? Is he going to be in New York tomorrow night having dinner? Is he going to be, you know, what a thing, So you go back into the courtroom, and as soon as they came through the door, the jurors with their heads down, crying. And the second juror through the door was a former Green Beret, and he was his head down. His head was down. And he was crying as he walked in. God, you just tell. I mean, I'd never been present in a courtroom before when a verdict was announced, but you just could tell instantly that these people wouldn't be walking back in like that. The first two through the door, crying if the verdict is not guilty. If they had all come to believe, they would be looking at him. They'd probably be smiling. I mean, so I'm sitting there and I'm surrounded. I got his mother is right next to me, and they say guilty. Boom, and what a heavy thing. I mean, it's just. They take him away in handcuffs, out the back door. For 7 weeks, I've been riding to court with the guy in the morning and then go back to the fraternity house, and all the people are there. And, it's just been that we were not at the fraternity house for 7 weeks, but for 5 weeks. His defense group was living in a fraternity house on the campus of North Carolina State University, where they had more freedom and privacy than in a regular motel. Then school started to start again. Moved to a regular motel. So it was actually a motel where people all had individual rooms. But I had to drive his mother back there. I had to keep